our actions ultimately, and our only focus is trying to find Madeline. And there's an innocent child missing. That's what anyone thinks, that's the key thing. Madeline is missing, and we're just doing our absolute best to maximise the chances of her being found.
On the evening of May 3rd, 2007, in the coastal town of Praia da Luz, Portugal, the world was introduced to a mystery that would haunt headlines, courtrooms, and living rooms for nearly 2 decades. 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from her family's holiday apartment, while her parents, Kate and Jerry, dined just a short walk away. In the hours and days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. Newspapers splashed her face across their covers. Television anchors spoke with trembling voices. And a desperate search began that is yet to find its ending. From the very first moment, 2 competing narratives took hold. On one side were grieving parents, devastated, frantic, and determined to find their missing daughter. On the other were whispers, growing louder with time, that these very parents might somehow be responsible. Could it be possible? Could 2 respected doctors, on holiday with their 3 young children, have killed their daughter, hidden her body, and orchestrated a flawless deception for 17 years, all while relentlessly campaigning for her return? At first, the idea sounds almost impossible, and perhaps that is why it has persisted for so long. The human mind craves resolution. It seeks patterns, culprits, a place to assign blame when the truth remains out of reach. And so, in the absence of answers, suspicion often fills the void. A look, a phrase, a body language cue, all become fuel for conspiracy. Soon the question shifts from what happened to Madeline to who is lying about it. But tonight, we are not here to blindly defend or to blindly accuse. We are here to step back from the noise, to examine what logic tells us, what evidence shows us, and what human psychology makes almost impossible to accept. To believe Kate and Jerry McCann are guilty, one must accept a cascade of improbabilities, each more extraordinary than the last. From hiding a body under the eyes of police and journalists, to maintaining a circle of 7 friends in perfect silence for more than a decade, to sustaining a worldwide campaign without ever slipping into contradiction, this theory demands near superhuman deception. And yet, that is the story many have chosen to believe. Why? Because suspicion is easier than uncertainty. Because grief can look unfamiliar. Because when the truth is unbearable, the world often invents villains. In this episode, we will retrace the steps of that night, revisit the evidence, and examine the narratives that have defined this case. We will ask the questions that matter. What does the evidence really prove? Where does suspicion end and fact begin? And most importantly, why has the world found it easier to suspect grieving parents than to confront the darker possibility that a child was taken by someone still unknown? To accept the idea that Kate and Jerry McCann killed their daughter requires us to believe a sequence of events that stretches the limits of reason, time, and human nature. Let us walk through what this theory demands, step by step. First, Madeline would have had to die sometime between 6:00 and 10:00 p.m. on May 3rd, 2007, while the family was on holiday in Portugal. During this narrow window, the McCanns were dining at the resort's tapas bar with 7 close friends, a group now known as the Tapas 7. According to the theory, in a span of perhaps 30 to 45 minutes, Kate and Jerry would have discovered their daughter's death, processed the unimaginable shock, agreed on a cover-up, and concealed her body. All of this while sitting at dinner, taking turns checking on the children and interacting with their friends. But that's only the beginning. They would then have needed to remove Madeleine's body from the apartment. In a resort full of tourists, journalists, hotel staff, and local residents. They had no car at the time. The Renault Scenic that later became the focus of suspicion wasn't rented until nearly a month later. So, we must believe they managed to move and hide her body without transportation, without assistance, and without anyone noticing. And then, if the theory is to be consistent, they must have returned weeks later, retrieved her remains, placed them in the rental car, and disposed of them permanently. All under the constant surveillance of international media and police investigators. Even more staggering, there is not a single piece of physical evidence to support this. No blood, no DNA, no trace of decomposition in the apartment. Cadaver dogs may have alerted in certain areas, but alerts without corroborating forensic evidence cannot stand as proof. Science demands confirmation, and none was found. And what about the Tapies 7? For the parental guilt theory to hold, we must also accept that this group of educated professionals, many of them doctors and parents themselves, decided to conspire in silence for over 13 years. Not one has ever confessed. Not one has broken ranks. Their accounts have remained consistent on the key facts, varying only in the minor details one would expect in any group retelling. To believe that 7 unrelated individuals would risk their reputations, careers, and families to protect the McCanns from a crime of this magnitude defies logic and human nature. Meanwhile, from the moment Madeline was reported missing, the McCanns lived under a spotlight few could withstand. Every movement was photographed, recorded, and scrutinized by the press. The Portuguese police, Interpol, and even British intelligence services were involved. Under this level of surveillance, how could 2 grieving parents orchestrate such a flawless cover-up? Where are the suspicious movements? The incriminating photographs? The witnesses? They don't exist. And if the McCanns had succeeded in this perfect crime, what sense would it make to spend the next 17 years drawing attention back to themselves? Rather than fading into the background, they did the opposite. They launched public appeals, established the Find Madeline Fund, filed lawsuits, appeared in courts, and campaigned across Europe. They kept her name alive long after the media spotlight might have dimmed. This is not the behavior of people hiding a crime. It is the behavior of parents who refuse to give up hope. Think for a moment about the psychological weight of this theory. 2 middle-class doctors with no criminal history, no violent background, and no psychological red flags suddenly execute a cover-up more sophisticated than anything orchestrated by seasoned criminals, all while grieving the loss of their child. Does that sound plausible? Or does it sound like suspicion stretching itself to fill the void of evidence? The alternative, as tragic as it may be, is far simpler and far more human. That an opportunistic predator, perhaps with insider knowledge of the resort, exploited a brief moment of vulnerability and abducted a child. Painful though it is, this explanation requires no suspension of disbelief. It does not ask us to believe in superhuman deception or impossible silence, or forensic evidence that never existed. It asks us to confront the darker reality, that sometimes children are taken, and that justice remains elusive. Among the most controversial elements in the Madeleine McCann investigation are the cadaver dogs. For many people, the image is unforgettable. A highly trained sniffer dog barking inside apartment 5A and near the boot of the McCann's rental car. To some, that bark was enough. Enough to suggest guilt. Enough to plant the seed that the parents had hidden something terrible. But a bark, no matter how dramatic it looks on television, is not a conviction. The facts are sobering. Despite multiple searches, no blood was found in the apartment. No bodily fluids, no tissue, not even DNA samples that could be matched conclusively to Madeline. The cadaver dogs signaled yes, but the alerts were never corroborated by physical evidence. In the world of forensic science, that matters, because without confirmation, a dog's bark is a lead, not proof. Even Martin Grime, the respected handler of the dogs, acknowledged their limitations. He stated clearly that no evidential reliability can be drawn from a dog's alert unless confirmed with corroborating evidence. In other words, the dogs point investigators in a direction. They do not deliver a final verdict. This aligns with broader research. A 2011 study on sniffer dogs revealed that in drug detection cases, prohibited substances were found in only 26% of searches following an alert. Even more striking, fewer than 1 in 500 alerts led to a successful prosecution. These statistics remind us that dogs, while impressive, are not infallible. They can be influenced by environmental factors, by stress, even by the subconscious cues of their handlers. In the McCann case, it is entirely possible that residual scent, traces carried on clothing, toys, or other items, triggered the dogs. Scientific studies have shown that the chemical compounds associated with human decomposition can linger on fabrics and surfaces long after the body is removed. They can transfer indirectly, cling to porous materials, and even intensify in hot weather. A bark in such circumstances does not necessarily mean a body was ever stored in the car or apartment. It simply means the scent was detected, and the source could not be identified. And yet, this single moment, the bark of a dog, was magnified by the media into something resembling a confession. Headlines screamed. Online forums swelled with speculation. To the public, the bark became a symbol, a shorthand for guilt. But symbols are not science, and suspicion is not evidence. In the absence of hard forensic proof, the cadaver dog alerts cannot stand as the foundation for a case against the McCanns. They are, at best, fragments of a larger picture that remains incomplete. To rely on them as the cornerstone of parental guilt is to ignore the very standards of justice that protect us all. The tragedy here is not only the disappearance of a child, but the way an uncorroborated signal has shaped public opinion for years. A bark became an accusation. But in the end, science tells us it was only a sound, loud, haunting, but legally meaningless. To understand why suspicion against the McCanns grew so powerful, one must examine the role of Gonçalo Amaral, the Portuguese investigator initially assigned to the case. His involvement has cast a long shadow, not only over the investigation itself, but also over public perception. Amaral's record was already controversial before Madeline disappeared. In 2004, he led the investigation into another missing child, 8-year-old Joanna Cipriano. That case ended in scandal. Joanna's mother, Leonor, was convicted of murder based on a confession later revealed to have been extracted under deeply questionable circumstances. Photographs showed her with visible bruises after police custody. Amaral insisted she had fallen down the stairs. Later, legal proceedings suggested otherwise. Though acquitted of direct assault, Amaral was found guilty of falsifying documents and misleading the court about how those injuries occurred. This stain on his reputation followed him into the McCann case. Less than a year after being removed from the investigation, Amaral published a book entitled The Truth of the Lie. In it, he argued that Madeline had died accidentally in the apartment and that her parents staged an abduction to cover it up. Presented not as speculation, but as a definitive narrative, the book ignited a firestorm. For many, it was the foundation of their suspicion against the McCanns. But legally, Amaral's conclusions were built on sand. At the time of publication, there was no body, no cause of death, no charges filed, and no physical evidence linking Kate or Jerry to a crime. His access to case information was partial, much of it contested. Yet the book was marketed as truth, not theory. For the McCanns, already enduring the trauma of their daughter's disappearance, this was devastating. They filed a defamation lawsuit, arguing that Amaral's claims had inflicted severe psychological harm and undermined ongoing efforts to find Madeline. Although the European Court of Human Rights eventually ruled in Amaral's favor on the grounds of free expression, that ruling did not validate the accuracy of his claims. It merely protected his right to publish them. The deeper problem remained. A man once entrusted with investigating the disappearance had profited from a still unsolved case, using his authority to amplify unproven allegations. This episode illustrates a larger issue within the Portuguese investigation. Critics accuse the police of tunnel vision, fixating on the parents early and failing to pursue other viable leads. Reports of suspicious individuals around the resort went largely unexamined. Witness statements about unusual behavior in the days before Madeline vanished were overlooked. It was easier, some argued, to build a narrative around the family than to explore more complex or uncomfortable possibilities. Amaral's book, far from clarifying the mystery, deepened the divisions. It fueled conspiracy theories, hardened public suspicion, and ensured that Kate and Jerry McCann would be fighting not only for their daughter's return, but also for their own reputations. For a child whose disappearance deserves truth and justice, the transformation of her case into a best-selling story of speculation was more than irresponsible. It was, in many ways, a betrayal. Of all the haunting details in the Madeleine McCann case, few are as disturbing or as suspicious as the disappearance of the resort's CCTV footage. In cases of abduction, surveillance cameras are often the first line of truth. They can retrace steps, capture suspicious figures, or confirm timelines. Yet, on the very night Madeline vanished, the Ocean Club's surveillance system produced nothing. Some reports suggest the cameras had stopped recording altogether. Others claim the footage simply vanished. Coincidence? Or something darker? The absence of such critical evidence raises chilling questions. How could every camera fail at the exact moment a child disappeared? If it was a technical fault, why was it never fixed before? If it was negligence, why did it occur during the most crucial window of time? And if it was deliberate, who had the access and authority to manipulate or delete the recordings? This leads to a theory many investigators and members of the public now consider plausible, that the abductor was not a random passerby, but someone with insider knowledge of the resort. Such a person would know the layout, the routines, and most importantly, the vulnerabilities. They would have seen that the McCanns and their friends dined at the same restaurant night after night, leaving the children alone for short intervals. They would have known when the apartment was unguarded, and if they also had access to the security system, they could disable or erase the footage to cover their tracks. This wasn't an impulsive act of opportunity. It had the hallmarks of planning, observation, calculation, the ability to move quietly in a tourist-filled resort and vanish without leaving a trace. Supporting this theory are reports of similar attacks and abductions in the Algarve in the years before Madeleine disappeared. Many remain unsolved. Some suggest patterns of behavior linked to trafficking networks operating with chilling efficiency. In such a context, the missing CCTV becomes more than an unfortunate detail. It becomes a red flag, a sign that whoever took Madeline may not have been an outsider stumbling upon an unlocked door, but someone who understood the system from within. Someone who knew not just when to strike, but how to erase the evidence afterward. Against this backdrop, the idea that two grief-stricken parents orchestrated a flawless cover-up in the midst of a media storm feels less credible than ever. The missing footage doesn't point to them, it points to someone else entirely. In 2020, more than a decade after Madeleine's disappearance, the case took a dramatic turn when German authorities named Christian Bruckner as the prime suspect. For many, this announcement felt like the first real breakthrough. At last, there was someone with a name, a history, and a disturbing profile that aligned with the possibility of abduction. Bruckner was not an abstract theory. He was a convicted criminal with a long history of theft, burglary, and sexual assault. Among his crimes was the violent attack of a 72-year-old American woman inside her vacation apartment in Praia da Luz, the very same resort where Madeline vanished. His method was chilling. He entered quietly, attacked without leaving traces, and slipped away undetected. That single case alone placed him squarely within the realm of plausibility as Madeline's abductor. Phone records added weight to the suspicion. Investigators traced Bruckner's mobile phone to a location near the Ocean Club Resort on the evening of May 3, 2007, about 90 minutes before Madeleine was reported missing. Presence near a crime scene does not prove guilt, but it is one of the first red flags investigators look for. Combined with his criminal history and his pattern of targeting holiday apartments, the evidence made him a person of serious interest. Yet, despite this troubling alignment, the case against Bruckner remains circumstantial. The timing of his phone call, around 7:00 p.m., leaves questions about whether he remained in the area for the hours that followed. There were no eyewitness accounts of him near the McCann apartment that night. No CCTV footage. No DNA, fingerprints, or items recovered to connect him directly to Madeleine. Even the alleged comment he once made to a friend suggesting he knew what happened remains unverified and potentially just prison boasting. The reality is stark. Bruckner fits the profile of someone who could have committed the crime, perhaps better than anyone before him. But fitting a profile is not the same as proving guilt. Without physical evidence or a confession, the suspicion lingers in the air without ever solidifying into certainty. In that sense, Bruckner is both a compelling suspect and a frustrating one. He embodies the darkness that might have swallowed Madeline, but he also represents the limits of the investigation, a case that seems to move forward in bursts of hope, only to stall again in the absence of definitive proof. 17 years after Madeleine McCann vanished, her case remains unsolved. But in many ways, the search for truth has been overshadowed by the weight of public opinion. From the beginning, Kate and Jerry McCann found themselves judged not just for what they did, but for how they appeared, their tone of voice, their body language. Even the words Kate cried out in shock, "They've taken her," were dissected endlessly. This is the tragedy within the tragedy. In the absence of hard evidence, suspicion grew out of symbols, gestures, and interpretations. Documentaries dramatized events. social media amplified theories, and soon the McCanns were fighting not only for their daughter's life, but for their own reputations. To some, they looked too composed, to others, not devastated enough. But grief is not a performance, and trauma does not follow a script. What might appear cold or calculated to strangers can, in reality, be dissociation or a desperate attempt to stay functional under unbearable pressure. Meanwhile, those who were guilty of nothing more than being parents on holiday became the villains in a story written by millions of strangers. Their efforts to campaign, to hire investigators, to keep Madeline's name alive, acts that should have been seen as relentless hope, were twisted into signs of deception. In a cruel irony, the very actions that marked them as devoted parents were recast as evidence of guilt, and yet, through it all, they have not stopped. They continue to run the Find Madeline campaign, to speak publicly, to demand answers. If they were guilty, the rational path would have been silence, retreat, and disappearance into private life. But they chose the harder road, one that invites endless scrutiny, but also keeps their daughter's face in the public eye. So, the question remains, who truly benefits from the narrative that blames the parents? Certainly not justice. Certainly not Madeleine. The easier story is not always the truer one. It is simpler to cast suspicion on those in plain sight than to confront the possibility of a predator still unpunished, still unseen. As we close, perhaps the lesson is this. In cases like Madeleine's, empathy must guide us more than suspicion. Before we accuse, we must ask ourselves, what would we do? How would we look if it were our child missing, our grief dissected, our every gesture put on trial? Sometimes the most extraordinary evidence is not in the theories we build, but in the strength it takes to keep searching for truth when the world has already made up its mind.